After you complete your work on a comp, you want to convert it into a format that people can watch, and that process is called rendering. Typically, you take a comp and render it into a type of video format that people can watch on broadcast television or DVDs or Blu-rays or on the internet. There are two basic approaches to rendering comps in After Effects. One is to use the render queue that's built into After Effects, or the other is to use the Adobe Media Encoder, which is a separate standalone program, but basically, though, that's the engine that drives the render queue inside After Effects. I tend to lean toward the Media Encoder, and I'll show you why inside this lesson. So let's take a look at both of those guys by going to Working Files, After Effects Projects, and go on down to 2202 Rendering. To make sure we're clear on this, you render a comp, you don't render a project. So you need to have a comp selected to start the render process. Now, right now, no comp is selected, neither here nor inside the project panel. So if I go to Composition, Add to Render Queue is not available to me. So if you see that, that's just because you don't have a comp selected. So go back here and select this comp here, Fish and Bubbles, and go back to Composition. Now I can add that to the render queue. The render queue typically shows up down here in the same frame as the timeline. And you see there are three basic options here. There's Render Settings, Output Module, and then Output To. Well, we work sort of counterclockwise here, starting with the render settings. You can click this disclosure triangle to see what they are currently. And if you look through these guys, if you read them quickly, you'll be able to see that they're probably pretty standard. Let's just take a look at a few things. Color depth, current settings. Now, the current settings for this comp are 8 bits per channel, which is fine, but you may want to raise that to something more to get richer color depth. Over here it says Field Renderer. You may want to turn that on if you're going to export to interlaced footage. Now, not many people use interlaced footage anymore. It's almost all progressive these days, but do keep that in mind if you need to change that. Time span. Right now it says Work Area. Lots of times when you're working in a comp, you reduce the work area bar to just part of your comp so that you can just do a RAM preview for that part. So if you choose work area, you may not get the entire comp. So you may want to change that. Or you may want to go back to your comp and make sure the work area equals the length of the comp. But for the most part, these settings are probably fine. But if you want to change them, you can click this drop-down list and select from a different setting, or just go for best settings here and change that inside the render settings dialog box. So for example, we may want to change the color depth here from the current 8 bits per channel to something more than that, like 16 bits per channel. And we may want to change the time span from the work area only to the length of the comp, just in case I didn't have the work area out to the length of the comp. Field renderer there is off, which is the way it should be for most cases, and I'm going to leave it off. But this is the place where you change the render settings. These are kind of generic settings. These are not specific to the type of output file format that you choose. So once I've got this done, I'm going to click OK, and now it's going to say Custom because I did change the best settings. I could go back and change the best settings inside Edit. I go Edit, Templates, Render Settings, and I can change the settings by editing it and saving it. Or I could create a whole new settings name if I want to. I'll just cancel out of that. All right, now that we've got that done, let's close that disclosure triangle. Let's look at the output module. Right now, lossless is the default. And inside Windows, the lossless format is AVI, which would be different if you're working in Mac. Nevertheless, this is the current settings for the output module. It's a little confusing. What's a module versus a format? Well, the module is kind of a container for the format and several other things. So usually you don't even bother opening up this little disclosure triangle. You go right to this guy by just clicking on it, and then you choose a file format. The file format by default here is AVI, but you can see there are many file formats. The de facto file format these days is H.264. That's a really good compression scheme. But some people may be exporting specifically to Blu-ray or to DVD, or you may want to work with QuickTime, things like that. Or you might want to do an image sequence, and you pick one of the many image sequences here. Or you might want to export to Flash, for example. It can be a little confusing when you choose one of these things because you're not done after you choose a format. Let's just go down to QuickTime, for example. That could be really confusing. You click on that. Once you click on QuickTime, you've got format options, which are really codecs. You click on this, and then you've got these codecs, compression, decompression schemes. And the codecs are numerous. You can choose them over here, whichever one you want to use. DVC Pro HD would be a high-level format or high-level codec, so I'll cancel out of that. If you choose something like H.264, your format options look entirely different. Here it's just basically give me some information about the quality you want as opposed to all the different codecs. Because this is different. QuickTime is a container, whereas H.264 would be more like a format. Click cancel out of that because I'm happy with the settings there. Now look down below here. It says resize. You probably don't want to resize, but if you do, here's where you do it. I'm going with the size of the comp. You probably don't want to crop because you could have done that in the comp, but you do have the option of cropping things now. And then take a look at audio output. This is where people forget to do audio output. By default, it's off. Even if you have audio in your project, it's going to be off. And so if you have audio in your project, make sure you click on audio output and then check something down here that'll work for you. Typically 48,000 kilohertz is the default audio output level. Stereo is fine, but there are more options here. But we're going to turn off audio for this one because there is no audio here in this particular case. Then you click OK. Now you need to give it a file name and a folder location. So you go to Output To, and then you click on this. You give it a file name and a location. So the default here would be where the project is stored. So that's fine. We'll say save there. But nothing happens when you click save. And a lot of people kind of walk away from their computer at this point. They click save, so they must be done, right? Not so. You've got to go over here and click render. When you click render, then it starts converting your comp into that file. In this case, an MP4 file because we selected H.264. Then you can watch the render progress bar up here. When it's done, it'll give you a little reminder that it's done. It also plays here, kind of like a RAM preview, as it renders. I'm going to just pause here. We'll fast forward to the end when it's done. There you go. It took about 1:20 to render that 10-second comp. So that just gives you an idea of how long this can take. That was a fairly simple comp, and it took 8 times the length of the comp to render it. Let's just take a quick look at the results. Here's Fish and Bubbles MP4. If I double-click on that, there we go. So the rendering worked just fine. Lovely. All right. I'm going to delete that. There we go. Let's go back to After Effects now. My feeling is that it's better to use the Adobe Media Encoder than to use the render queue, only because I think it's a good practice to use the Media Encoder because it's kind of a universal tool that you can use in other products within the Adobe Creative Suite. So I'm going to just shrink this down a little bit like this, close you down, and go to the Adobe Media Encoder over here. Now, the Adobe Media Encoder is the engine behind the render queue inside After Effects, and so when you use one, you're using the other. But let me just kind of bring this down a bit too so you can see it. The way you use the Adobe Media Encoder with After Effects is that there's no direct route to it from After Effects that I'm aware of. I wish there were. There is one inside Premiere Pro, but there isn't one here as far as I know. So the easiest way to do this is to open up the Adobe Media Encoder directly and then take whatever comp you want to then render and just drag it over here like that. Then it'll take whatever the last settings you use over here, for example, and put them here. Let me just close this down now, maximize this. You can then click on this, and then go to the Export Settings dialog box. Choose a different format here. It tends to be a little more intuitive over here. If I go to H.264 here, you're going to notice that there are many presets. And I like the presets here, all kinds of presets. I would typically go with HD 1080p 2997, but nevertheless, there are all kinds of presets here. You can also adjust the video settings here and the audio settings here. The tabs are a little more intuitive than they are inside the After Effects render queue. Then I click OK. And then over here I can say what exactly is the preset that I want to use, which again takes me to the Export Settings dialog box. So, it's not one of those things you got to go one, then the other. You click on one and you can take care of both things at once. And finally, the output file is also something that's available inside the Export Settings dialog box. Again, it's kind of like 3 things built in the one dialog box. It's just much more intuitive. You don't need to go one to the next to the next. But if you do need to change it, you can click on this and change the file folder location or change the file name. And then when you're done here, when you're ready to go, and you've got a number of things lined up, or you've got this one thing lined up, you just click on this little green button here, and that starts the queue. And it does basically the same thing it just did in After Effects. So as I mentioned, I tend to lean toward working with the Media Encoder when I render inside After Effects. In any event, you can use the render queue or the Media Encoder to render your comps.